Welcome to the first in our series of Tea and Talks with myself, Owen Smith. Today we are delighted to be joined by the lovely Mr. Vivyan Ellacott, retired theatre manager of the Kenneth More Theatre and director. How are you today, Viv?
I'm fine, yes, thank you. I'm getting quite excited about this 21st century technology here.
Is this your first Zoom call, as it were?
This is my first time I've ever sat in front of a computer and seen a little picture of myself, and it's horrendous. However, yes.
How's your quarantine going so far?
Well, there's plenty of stuff to be done. I'm working on my website, which has all the technical stuff about musical theatre and history of theatre, and updating that. So the brain is very active. The body is sort of falling apart with lack of exercise, but the brain is still going.
Good.
So working on Censor, where do you want to start?
So what originally got you into theatre?
Oh, right. I was a child. I was a farmer's son. My dad was running the farm. My mum was running a grocery business, and the grocery business was right next door to the Swansea Empire in South Wales, the Swansea Empire. And at that time, we're before telly, we're before all the channels on the telly. The weekly change of program at the Swansea Empire, a big variety show, was the exciting bit of entertainment. Being right next door to it and a pushy little kid, I'd be nipping up the alley into the stage door, and I became a kind of mascot for the backstage. It also helped. Those of your older listeners will remember, no, they're not old enough, that there was food rationing, and the people at the theatre were doing very well to keep in with my mum, running a grocery shop, and my dad running a farm where there'd be a little bit of extra food. So I was a very welcome kid in the empire, very welcome. Of course we look after your little boy, Mrs. Ellacott. So I stood in the wings and I watched show after show. Every day after school, I'd be there watching the show, usually the first house. And this would be like, 6-year-old, 7-year-old, 8-year-old. I was absolutely hooked on rather, looking back on it, tacky variety. It was all variety shows. It was Old Mother Riley, Laurel and Hardy. It was all those kind of visitors. And I was sort of absolutely hooked on the whole theatre atmosphere as a child. And then when I went to school, you may find this hard to believe, but I went to a fairly posh school, and the fairly posh school play, in those days, they didn't do things like Oliver and Bugsy. They did Shakespeare. So at the age of 11, I'm suddenly introduced to Shakespeare, and I'm doing Shakespeare's Henry V, playing a little page boy or something. And I suddenly now discovered a completely separate bit of theatre. There was the theatre of all the singing and dancing, kicking your legs up, magicians and acrobats. And then there was the theatre of Shakespeare and learning speeches and whatever. So basically, I didn't have a chance. I was hooked from the beginning.
Was there any stand-up performances you remember at the Swansea Empire?
Old Mother Riley was a huge favourite. I remember there were a couple of shows I wasn't allowed to watch, except I did, of course. I'd hide somewhere and watch them because they were a little bit too naughty. They were comics like Max Miller was considered a bit too naughty for a little schoolboy to be watching. And they did the occasional play. And I do remember a play called No Trees in the Street, which apparently was all about a fallen woman. And it had notices like, adults only. And I remember being very, very upset that I wasn't allowed to go in and watch an adults only show. No Trees. I've never heard of it since. So if anybody knows a play called No Trees in the Street, they could tell me the plot.
So how did you end up from being a Swansea boy to ending up in Ilford?
Well, that was basically, I came to London University. When I left school, I came to London, and uh, I wasn't in those days. In those days, you could get a grant to go to university. Now you get a loan and you have to pay it back. Something went wrong with my grant, and it wasn't sufficient to live off. So I was doing the university during the day, and in the evenings, getting a job. And the only thing I knew was theatre. So I'd be working usheretting, I'd be selling programs and a bit of backstage shifting scenery. And that got me into, at some point, the Royal Opera House. I was backstage at Covent Garden. At the time, I wanted to be backstage at Drury Lane doing the jobs, because that's where they were doing the musicals, the sort of things I liked. And I really hated the idea of fat opera singers screeching in foreign languages. And then you only do a few days working at the Royal Opera House, working backstage, and suddenly became totally hooked on opera. So there was something magical about the West End London theatre, with its range of everything from plays to opera. And when I finished at university, I was really keen to work in London, in the London theatre. It didn't work out that way. I ended up doing several years in weekly rep back in Swansea, and I was assistant manager of the Swansea Theatre. Weekly rep is something that most of the people listening to this will have no idea what we're talking about, but it was full-time theatre, 40 weeks of the year. Every single week we put on a different show. Every single week a different show, which meant you were learning a whole show, a different show each week going on. It got to the point where if you noticed on next week's play you only had a small part, you were thrilled. In the old days, you really wanted to play the leads, but you think, God, you were so tired. There was a small, and I did a couple of years of weekly rep, but all the time there was the attraction of coming back to London. And there was an advert appeared for initially a new theatre being built in Ilford, Ilford, Essex. And I thought, well, Ilford, Essex, it's in the country, but it's sort of fairly near London. It was a bit nearer London than Swansea. So I kind of applied for this job at Ilford, Essex. I came up to London, lovely, got on a train at Liverpool Street to come to Ilford, expecting to see Ilford country, the Essex. And of course, the train did nothing but run through London, 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 till it got to Ilford, Essex. And they were building a new theatre in Ilford, and it was quite an interesting prospect because something had gone horribly wrong. When Redbridge was formed, about 50 years ago, something like that, over 50 years, I think, they decided they wanted to build a proper centre of culture in the town. And they had plans. The town hall was going to be knocked down, and the town hall was going to be replaced with a major 1,000-seater concert hall cum theatre. Across the road would be a little studio theatre, which was to replace one. The amateurs had a small theatre. Peep. The amateurs had a small theatre in the area, and the council were knocking it down to build a Sainsbury's. So they promised to build them a little studio theatre. And they were going to build that across the road from the big new concert hall. There'd be a major library, a major concert hall, marvelous plans, so clever. The grand piano on the stage of the major concert hall, where the town hall is, would go down on a lift, go across the road, and come up on a lift into the library for concerts, or up onto the lift into the little studio theatre. This was an incredible plan. And of course, like so much that happens in Redbridge, the whole thing got scrapped at the last minute. There was at the start of the 70s, There was a economic failure, collapse. The whole thing got scrapped. The town hall had a preservation order put on it. So the idea of building a new town hall in Barkingside went to the wall. And all they were left with was the little site across the road for the studio theatre for the amateurs. And at that point, they decided, well, since there was only going to be one theatre on this one spot, could they turn that little studio theatre into something a bit bigger? So it would be more multi-purpose. And the amateurs said, oh, no, we don't want anything with more than 200 seats, the amateur play companies. The amateur musical companies said, no, it's got to have 800,000 seats before it'll work. There was a big amateur company that said it mustn't have any professional work in it because, you know, we're a big amateur organization in Ilford. And some of the councillors were saying, no, we want to bring in commercial professional shows. And there was this whole terrible mess. We want a new theatre, but nobody knows what size, what it's to do and whatever. And they were looking for somebody to come in, sit down, propose what should happen, talk to all the various people, and effectively manage the situation. And that was an enormous challenge. And in I came and said, okay, let's see what we can do. And what we could do was to end up with the Kenneth More Theatre.
You came down for an interview. I always remember a story you used to tell me, something to do with a bag.
Oh, yes. Now, everything to do with the council was, of course, councillors, respectable elderly gentlemen. In those days, we had aldermen going back a long time. And the board that I was being interviewed by had Alderman Cowan, elderly, respectable gentleman with an OBE after his name, I think. A usual lineup of councillors. And in I come, in the 70s, I was a trendy young actor. Would you believe I had flowing black hair? You know, in the 70s, we had that sort of hair. I think the Viva Zapata moustache had gone, but I most certainly had the shoulder bag and the flares. And, I think my interview seemed to go rather well because I was bright and young and I had the right ideas and I was pushy. And a number of the councillors said, yes, he looks like a good bloke for the job. But the chairman, Alderman Cowan, actually said, can we give the job to a man who wears a handbag? My handbag, my shoulder bag, nearly cost me the job in Ilford. Yes, I'd forgotten that till you reminded me. Yeah.
I always love that story. Yeah. So what was your first show you actually opened with at the theatre then?
Well, we opened the theatre with The Beggar's Opera. This is a John Gay musical from 1740 something. And the reason being, by tradition, The Beggar's Opera is considered to be a lucky show. It's the show was so lucky that it made enough money for John Gay to build Covent Garden. When theatres have had problems over the years, stick on The Beggar's Opera and it'll make money. It was the show, the theatre at Covent Garden was run by a man called Christopher Rich, and The Beggar's Opera was written by a man called John Gay. And The Beggar's Opera is the show that made Gay rich and made rich gay. So that John Gay became rich because of the show, and Christopher Rich became gay and happy because the show was such a success. So it's a big cast, and the point was the theatre was to be a mixture of amateurs and professionals all the way through. So we had professional artists playing the leading roles and a large company from all the different amateur companies playing the supporting roles. And it was a big, big show running for 2 weeks to open the theatre. And it only played to about 60%. Can you imagine a brand new theatre opening with all the publicity, everybody curious to see, and it only managed about 60%. So it covered its costs. So, but it didn't make me rich. It didn't. And what we needed to discover was that the theatre's support for a long time was from the amateur companies. The amateur companies coming in, doing their shows, were really the ones that were bringing in the big audiences. And only gradually did we bring in the professional shows and the professional star names to make that side of it work. And then, of course, came the end of the first year when we put on the first professional pantomime in Ilford since the Hippodrome had been bombed. Was it Wodes? Yes, Wodes were doing an amateur pantomime, very good amateur pantomime at the Hawkey Hall every year, but there was no professional panto in Ilford. And the professional panto did so well, and it established that, you know, there was a good income from professional acts as well as the amateur thing to make it work. This is a long time ago. This is 45 years ago. You know, Ilford was a very different place all those years ago.
So what's your sort of standout moments at the theatre?
Very hard to tell. Because of my background in the old Swansea Empire and the variety, there were nights, occasions, shows when we bring in an old variety act who had played the Swansea Empire and played the Ilford Hippodrome and was now playing the Kenneth More Theatre. And that link, where you have a brand new theatre stuck in the centre of the town, where it is part of a tradition that went back to the Ilford Hippodrome and to the old variety circuits. So there were people like Tommy Trinder playing. And there was an artist that nobody's heard of now, a lady called Adelaide Hall. Adelaide Hall played the Kenneth More Theatre. She was 90 when she played. She had been a huge hit on Broadway in 1928. In 1928, she'd been the star of a show on Broadway. She'd starred at the Palladium in 1948. She'd sung with Duke Ellington. And the fact that we were part of that tradition, that was the thing that were the standout moments for me. And then the other, of course, standout moments would be certain shows that you put on where you actually felt, wow, the production, the show, the performance, the whole level has hit a standard, an excitement that will stick with you forever. And there have been a number of shows like that. Some of them were operas because of the wonderful Edna Graham conducting. Some of them were musicals and some of them were plays.
If you had to choose one, what would it be?
Very hard. If I was choosing a musical, it would be Sondheim's Pacific Overtures, which is not one of the more famous Sondheim ones, but it's the Sondheim one where he has a nod towards Japanese kabuki theatre. And the fact that I knew nothing about Japanese kabuki theatre, I knew nothing about traditional Japanese music and how it mixes with Western music. And the fact that we put on a production where I had to completely learn a new approach to theatre. It was such a challenge all around for the orchestra and for the players. And as a musical, for me, that was one of the highlights. That really was, you know, like challenged, stretched, and beautifully done. So Sondheim comes fairly high on that. The first early productions that we did of Peter Schaffer's Amadeus sticks there because there were some stunning performances in that. And I'm sitting there so proud of what those actors have actually achieved on stage. And so they stand out for the level of achievement we actually got through. but there were so many of them. Did they work out when I retired? I'd done something like 250 plays and operas, and they all merge into one. I can't remember.
Is there any play or musical or opera that you wish you had got to have directed?
Oh, that's an interesting question. I'm not sure that there is, because I did them all, because I did so many of them. No, probably not. Probably not. I probably reached the point of deciding to retire on the grounds that the challenges for me and the wish list had sort of kind of awful thing to say, been there, done that, but it was that kind of feeling, I think. Of course, since I retired, which is now coming up to 9-10 years, there've been a number of shows that have happened that I would love to have directed in the intervening 10 years, but that's a slightly different question, isn't it? That's the sort of, which of the more recent shows would you have jumped at? Yeah.
So what have you done since your retirement? Because you've not stopped.
No, that was quite yes. I got involved in, I had been involved before the Kenneth More closed for a long time. We have to go back here, and I have to tell you that after I'd been at the Kenneth More for a couple of years, I had realized that artistically, there was a kind of ever increasing circle, and that with an audience of 350, a budget fixed as it is, there was only a certain limit to which I could stretch myself. And I went to the Board of Governors and said, look, I feel that I must go. I feel I must go to stretch myself artistically. And they said, oh, we'd like you to stay. So we did a wonderful deal whereby I was employed by the Redbridge Theatre Company to run the Kenneth More Theatre and allowed to do as much freelance work as I could. The conditions were I could go out and freelance as long as the work at the Kenneth More didn't suffer. Interesting thing, nobody ever actually wrote down who would decide that the work at the Kenneth More Theatre was suffering, but that never cropped up as a problem. And I'd gone out and I'd started to work in Europe. My big love being opera, I started to get some opera work in bigger theatres and more challenging. And I was failing to get opera work in the UK because from the Kenneth More, we'd had a few big rock musical hits. The biggest rock musical hits being the Rocky Horror Show, which toured for 7 years and whatever. And I had a reputation for doing rock musicals in this country. And the opera companies in this country was sort of going, no, you're a rock person. No, I'm a director. But I'd got some opera work in Europe, Eastern Europe, and it was fascinating. Initially behind the Iron Curtain even, a totally different world. So when I retired, I thought, yeah, I want to go into some of these less developed areas and work. And Romania turned out to be a particular favorite. I worked in Hungary and the Czech Republic, but Romania was a particular favorite. And because of my involvement in Romania, I was asked if I'd give some lectures in a university in Romania. And it was just a guest lecture, go in and give a guest lecture. And for some reason, they enjoyed it and they invited me to come back regularly. So I went through the first 7 years, I think, of my retirement. I'd go 3 times every year to Romania to lecture on English literature and theatre in a university in Romania, put on shows, do various things. Incredible achievement. I mean, I don't speak any Romanian. All I could do was I could order wine I could order wine without any problem. But the quality of English, spoken English there is incredible, particularly in the universities. So I had a kind of 7 or 8 year run of regular visits to Romania, teaching, working, directing, and doing other little bits and pieces. So it was a bit of a change from Ilford, but it was interesting.
And what's next?
Next, well, who knows? At the moment, we're sitting here locked in, unable to walk the streets, unable to go to any theatre, unable, so who knows? One hopes that give us about 6 months and everything returns in a huge explosion of interest. And as long as the coronavirus doesn't get me, I could be probably sitting in the audience watching, whether I've got the energy now to do the full direct. Although, what was the name of the American George? What's it? Who was 105 when he was still directing in the West End.
George Abbott.
George Abbott. George Abbott. Yes, that's
So just for people that aren't used to us chatting, this is actually a regular occurrence with me and Mr. Ellacott, that we'll sit and take about 5 minutes to find a name. This is our future.
I've got a good excuse because I'm knocking on very agedly. You've got no excuse at all. It could be drink in your case or something is affecting me. Yeah, could be. There we are.
It's libelous.
So a very long career, which sort of started in South Wales, did a huge chunk of it in Redbridge, and then sort of quietly sort of petered into Romania. I'm quietly sitting here, coping with modern technology and interviews and reminiscing and quietly sinking into the twilight of my theatrical career.
Thank you for joining me, Viv. Stay safe.
And the same to you. Thank you. Bye.